Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am, of course, Josh Bycer, and we have another developer chat lined up for this week's show. My guests tonight, they are the director from Perfect Garbage, an indie studio, and they're on to talk a little bit more about writing narratives in games and just a general talk about game design, which I love so much. So please welcome to the cast, Sun.
Howdy. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm making it. It's definitely the tail end of the summer in the indie game sphere. That's like where everything is happening. All the conventions are lining down and things like that. So I've been busy. How are you?
I am doing all right, trying to keep busy and sane around here, I suppose. Doing videos, writing. I have to start writing my fifth book in like a month or so. I have
Ooh,
to start getting into that.
God, good luck.
Thank you. But it is great to have you on. Yep, it is, as always, another crazy time in the game industry, I'm sure, for everyone involved. Thankfully, I do all myself remotely, so I don't have to worry about too much in terms of conventions. But I know there are a lot of developers itching to get back into into contacting people in person.
Oh yeah. I miss it so much. The internet is great for immediate kind of gratification contact, but nothing beats a conference or a convention. I'd much rather be safe first, but I do miss it.
Hmm. But we are recording this literally on Labor Day weekend. So I'm sure for those of you watching this, by the time you're watching this, you should be, I guess, back to work and dreaming of this weekend at the moment.
Yes. I'm dreaming of it now. It hasn't even started. It's so close.
Yep. But we have, I guess, some work to get to tonight. We have a lovely cast to record. So, since this is your first time on, Sun, for people listening, could you talk a little bit about who you are and what your background is?
Sure. So I'm Sun M. I work as the studio director of Perfect Garbage. I'm one of the co-founders. I also work as a narrative designer for a studio called Silver Ring Games, who are doing something very, very cool. Highly recommend looking into them. I've worked in comics actually before I do games.
Nice.
So lots of narrative stuff came from comics, transitioned into games, and all of that good things. Yeah, I like to pretend I'm a jack of all trades, master of none, but good enough to pass.
So, what comics have you written for people listening?
Yeah, so I have written the long-standing webcomic called Animal Heads. We've been around for 2 years, with something exciting happening with that soon. I have also written for DC on an unannounced project that's coming up, as well as D2 Comics. Same thing. NDAs are a thing.
Yes.
um, but I mainly work in a lot of like self-published free reign comics. I kickstarted my first comic was A Vampire in Paris. We launched it in 2018 and it did really well and we were very happy with it. And I've got I should tell you the big one. I have a graphic novel coming out published by HarperCollins in 2022 or
Nice.
2023 depending. And it's called Thief of the Heights. So you can buy that in your local bookstores and pre-order that eventually in the future.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It means a lot.
Yeah. When did you start Perfect Garbage?
So I started Perfect Garbage around 2018, and I started it when I was on my way home from a trip, and I called my co-founder Emmett late at night in the airport, and I was like, "Do you want to make a studio?" Actually, I said, "Do you want to make a game?" And then you have to follow it up with making a studio.
Of course, yeah. It's kind of like step one and step two there for a lot of
Right?
people.
Yeah. Usually you start with like, "I really want to make this type of game," and then you're like, "Wow, I'm gonna need a lot of people to do the things that I need to do." Or I have to learn a lot to do the things that I need to do, and then the studio ends up coming up after.
Hmm. So, what kind of attracted you to making a video game after kind of getting your start with comics and graphic novels like that?
I honestly think it's the barrier to entry for me, anyway. When I got into comics, comics were more accessible for me to get into.
Hmm.
I had a lot of backgrounds. I worked really my closest friends were artists, and we kind of teamed up a lot of the time. So I was able to do comics. I've always wanted to do games, but I'm no programmer. So it just felt like such a far off construct to me when I was younger. And the older I got and the more self sufficient I got in like producing content and creating narratives, I realized that making a game isn't as inaccessible as I used to think it was. I definitely learned a lot rapidly when I started the journey, but it felt a lot more feasible by the time I had called Emmett. It
Hmm.
felt like something I could do, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, like, the last decade in particular has been really huge for indie development, just kind of raising awareness for it. For a lot for people listening, like, if you are new, like, I have spoken to developers literally all around the world. And, like, right now, like, one of the big trends I'm seeing is, like, out of Brazil, with a lot of, like, new and upcoming studios coming out of that country.
Mm.
And it has certainly gotten so much easier to get in the game industry, but I think by as like a contrast, it's also gotten a lot harder to
Mm.
kind of get yourself established and get your name going in terms of a game.
Yeah, it's a lot of upkeep. I would argue that social media has become such a huge factor in getting a studio
Hmm.
out there and getting recognized to the point where I even think it's a factor sometimes when pitching games because in the indie sphere we have to pitch oftentimes if we can't self fund,
Hmm.
and having those types of stats are always a plus. I mean, I keep saying so that's not a great podcast thing, but I do think that we all know how important wish lists and things like that are in data sets. And so the best way to gather more wish lists or gather more attention to your game is to be prominent on social media.
Hmm.
Uh, so with the rise of many game studios, I'm also hoping there's a continued rise of community managers who are awesome.
Yep, and it's something that I definitely still struggle with a lot in terms of, having to be on all the time on Twitter, constantly doing updates. I'd rather do the fun stuff like make videos and write books.
Oh my god, do I agree? I definitely waste way too much time online.
Mm,
Way too much time, but I am thankful that I did it at the time that I did. You can't
mhm,
run a Kickstarter, and that's kind of how we did our debut game. We kickstarted it.
mhm.
You can't run a Kickstarter without being online.
No, you cannot, especially in today's market.
Mhm.
So, for your studio, like, what for people listening, like, what kind of games do you make, and what kind of games are you interested
Yeah, so this is a complicated question.
in?
And I know that sounds weird, but our first game was a visual novel. We did an interactive story following two cyborgs in a cyberpunk future. We're big fans of sci-fi and horror in the studio. Big fans of horror. And we knew we wanted to do kind of like a psychological thriller type game as our first game. Thing is, we started with a VN because we agreed that that would be something that we could feasibly do when we were learning. And we were really, really happy with it. It's called Love Shore. It's on Steam. You could wish list it. Haha. Plug. And the demo is out there too. And that was our first game, and we really, really loved it. We still love it. It's on its way out, and we've actually received prototype funding for our second game. And we've been working on that. And our second game is completely different. It is a action side scroller horror game as well. So we've jumped mechanically into a different direction, and we've taken a new turn on narrative because Perfect Garbage's kind of main statement, like our big goal as a studio, is that we want to make narrative focused games with really cool genres. We want to be weird. We want to make you pleasantly surprised when you play our games. I think I jokingly wrote on our Twitter that we want to bring the bash and genre mash for all of our games. So those are the types of games that we're focused on. Our dream is to be a fully self-sustaining studio. We look up to studios like Supergiant Games, who can basically self-fund and self-sustain with other resources and can self-publish because of that, which is our big dream as well.
Hmm.
As for games that we like, we're all over the place as a studio. I can tell you what I personally like. I fell in love with games like Dishonored and Castlevania and God, so many things. Splatterhouse. I can name a million horror-based games specifically. I love Outlast, things like that. And that's definitely influenced the studio, but I am very lucky that I work with 10 other individuals who are all equally into horror movies.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and my next book that's out in October is all about horror design too.
Oh, I need to buy it like ASAP.
Yep, there's my plug for the cast as well. Yeah, and oh man, we could certainly spend a lot of time talking about horror as well. I can tell we gotta be really careful here because I know you have to go in about like 45 minutes or so. I don't want to keep you late for your appointment.
I can't resist. So if you summon horror, I'm gonna talk about it. I'll waste the rest of the time we have.
I'm happy that I think you're like the first person I've heard mention Splatterhouse, because that's not a name we normally hear from games or from developers these days. Because I remember that franchise very well.
Yeah, it's a classic. It's a classic near and dear to my heart.
So, getting back to what you were just saying about kind of doing genre mashups, this is something that I see developers try. It's very risky to do because you are essentially trying to, in some cases, you put a square peg into a round hole. I guess in terms of like what you and the rest of the people at Perfect Garbage have been like doing in terms of research or looking into things, like I guess how are you preparing for doing like genre mashups?
Yeah, so we're very picky on what we want to do. I do agree that there's just I feel like the most important thing to know is that every genre isn't real, which is a really hot topic statement. I know someone's going to come running at me. But what I mean by that is that every genre is traditionalized in some way. We know what to think of a brawler because have a tradition of what a brawler is.
Hmm.
And so I think what really helps with genre mashing or creating new perspectives, which is our whole goal in PG, is we want to create new perspectives for game classics, like game tropes that we all love,
Hmm.
is that we have to be aware that we're going to break the rules sometimes. We're not going to make a game that, let's just say it's a top-down card game. I don't know. I'm giving an example. We're not going to be so hard on ourselves to follow the rules of what a card game should be like.
Hmm.
We want to make sure we can emulate the feeling, how it plays, what it feels like, but still make it loose enough that when we do mix it with another genre, we're not alienating two faves or completely putting ourselves in tight boxes.
Hmm.
I think the moment that you try to perfect a genre that you're in and you don't give yourself some freedom to kind of broaden it is the moment you can't really make anything new because you're just following a formula, right?
Hmm.
So we want to make sure that we can pay a lot of respect to the formulas that led the foundation of the great gameplay that we love, but still invent upon them so we're not making the same game over and over again.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the risks that I see, or like a trap that I see a lot of developers fall into, is that when they chase like the extremes of the genre,
Mm.
as in we want to make the most brutally difficult 2D platformer, but you also want it to be the most grind heavy RPG on the market. And the problem with that is when you're going for genre mashups, you really need to be careful what aspects you take of each respective genre. Because I have played plenty of games that have tried to combine like action RPG design, and either I get frustrated as predominantly an action game fan, or the RPG fans get frustrated because there's all this action that they have to do in it.
Yeah. I think understanding the elements of what you want is super important. And
Hmm.
also understanding, and this is another hot topic because I come from a lot of biz dev background. I
Hmm.
spend a lot of time learning the business side of things and the marketing side of things as opposed to just the development side of things.
Hmm.
And something I've learned is that as much as you want to make whatever you want to make, you should also be aware of the audience to those genres too.
Hmm.
And what are you giving to that audience? A great example will be brawlers, which I'm like kind of teetering in. There's a really intense subset group of what a brawler should be or what people want out of a brawler. And if you're going to make a genre breaking brawler, I think you should need to still pay respect to that.
Hmm.
But and the best way to do that, and I actually think this is my tried and true like secret method on how I think you can genre bash and take some extremes, is that make it accessible.
Hmm.
If you make a game that is built on a very intense genre, let's say grinding, but you make it accessible for someone who's never played either of those genres that you've listed, then you've basically almost made a new subset in that way. Because now you can cater to older fans who might appreciate some aspects of the game, maybe not all of it because it's not their genre, but you've also made a gateway to a lot of people who've never played an action or an RPG, right? And they want to try it, and now this element has both. I do think I'm not a big fan of games that are really hard just to be really hard. So I can't give any note to that. There's a reason I prefer Bloodborne over Dark Souls. But I think that in like a much to paint with a big brush, if you make games that you know the exact audience of, like you know who you're selling this game to, those folks will come and appreciate it. And then the fans of what you were basing it off might also come as well. Audience is key.
Yep.
You can't just make a game for yourself. I mean, I think you can, but you can't make money off of it.
And I gotta ask, do you have like my latest oracle that you're like reading as you're describing? Because you're just like telling exactly what I just said in my recent post I made up for a game developer.
No, but I believe that means you're probably really, really smart. And I've like learned this. I've learned this through trial and error.
But yeah, and as another fan of brawlers as well, you gotta be really careful. That could easily be another hour on top of the horror discussion as well.
Love me a brawler. I've been replaying a lot of classics lately for no reason, but it's been fun. I'm a big fan of fighting games. Like I spent a lot of my high school mastering Guilty Gear XXR. Nice. Just a lot.
The funny thing for me is that I love brawlers and action games, but fighting games have just been like my Achilles heel. I am terrible at just about every fighting game. I think Soul Calibur is like the only one that I can put up a decent fight in.
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely a skill because I am not a fighting game person either. I just really love Guilty Gear. Just really love that one game. I think it's the pretty animations. I'm going to be honest. I think I'm suckered by the pretty animation.
And going back to what you were just saying about kind of like researching the genre and knowing the market, that is something that I have said many times on these casts and the videos. And it is a very tough line, I think, sometimes for developers to walk. And again, especially if you're trying to mix different markets. Like you said with the brawler example, that if you're like, if let's say you want to make a brawler and you are basing it entirely on, I don't know, like Streets of Rage or Final Fight, you're going to get people who like that game. But if you adhere too much to it, then you run the risk of really, segmenting the amount of people who could actually play it. And I like what you said about making it as kind of a gateway or having those approachability aspects, because this is something that I was just talking about, that there's going to be a lot of people who will try out a game, whether it's because they heard it was cool, they know the developer or whatever, and they may be on that kind of borderline of, I either want to be super into it or I don't want to touch it, it's way too demanding for me. And what we've seen out of like a lot of the really great developers is taking that eye towards not just, the people who know the genre inside out, but understanding what can drive people away and putting in, safeguards or guardrails, however analogy you want, to give somebody a chance to try and learn it. Like with Dark Souls, like in the post I just made, which again, for those of you listening, will probably be several weeks old at this point, but I talked about what could be potential pain points in the Souls-like genre and ways to kind of get around it. And again, like, to an expert, none of those issues matter in the slightest. But to somebody who is new or is interested, they could each be their own respective mountain they need to climb.
Yeah, this is a total side comment, but nothing is more emotional than playing a lot of Devil May Cry and then trying to play Dark Souls right after. Because that has made me cry many a time.
Oh yeah, like every time I play like almost like all the Souls likes, and each one has like different timing. So every time I
Oh,
switch games, it's like my brain takes like 30 minutes to have to like reboot to get back into the new timing.
I'm glad it only takes you 30 minutes. I don't get it the whole time. I keep dodging, and I don't understand why I die so fast.
The worst thing, like the absolute worst thing that happened to me was when I don't know if you know the game Crypt of the Necro Dancer. That is like
No.
it's a rhythm-based, turn-based roguelike. So you have like the
Ooh.
music, you have to like follow your movement to like the metronome and like the beat.
Mhm.
And I have no rhythm, as people listening who are my fans can well attest to. So I play the game for like 20 minutes, and then I swap to another game, and my entire like internal like rhythm and motion of playing that game was completely thrown off because I was still
Oh,
like
no.
thinking about the beat of that song.
I get that. I think that's actually something that happens in, brawlers, because I
Hmm.
think a lot of the combat is surprisingly rhythmic in those games. They're
Hmm.
paced in a very fun way, and then you switch to, like, The Witcher, and you're like, "Oh, no.
Mm.
Everything moves so slow here."
Oh yes.
Uh,
And I guess like for like you and Perfect Garbage, like in terms of like we already talked about these from like a marketing standpoint, but in terms of like the design, say you were thinking about with like mashing up genres, I guess what is kind of like your thought process if you're taking like two very different genres? So like let's say deck building and action game, or first person shooter and RPG, or something where it feels like the two genres couldn't necessarily mesh well.
I so I have a lot of philosophies. My first of
Hmm.
all is what how Perfect Garbage works is a very unique system, and I actually hope a lot of studios who have like small teams that everyone like values equally should consider is that we actually pitch each other our next games.
Hmm.
We all come in a room and we're like, okay, I'm gonna sell you my idea. And it's so funny because my co-founder Emmett is very narrative focused, and so he'll pitch through narrative, but I'm very mechanics focused. And so when I pitch, I am like the plot's somewhere, but the narrative, the mechanics, this is what we'll do. And I really think that to approach genre bashing, I really think that is really important on what aspects you value of those genres.
Hmm.
Because if you value the narrative that card game systems provide and you like the style of a first person shooter, you can combine them. Because you're taking the aspect of one genre and putting it in another. You're not actually mixing both mechanics equally. And I think that's like a really smart approach is kind of when you break down the core concepts of what makes a genre that you like, and find the elements that are the most easy to move in a way that you'll appreciate them into something else. I think it's really, really hard. I'm not saying it's impossible to have a full 50-50 mashup.
Hmm.
I'm sure it exists. I'm sure lots of indie developers are doing it, and making some really cool things. But for my approach, I really value picking the smaller aspects of the games that I like and seeing how they marry other smaller aspects of games that I like.
Hmm.
Because that way I'm creating something new, but I'm not putting, again, my fear, putting myself in a box where I have to somehow build a card system in a first person shooter.
Hmm.
That sounds nuts, but maybe I can build a randomizer with the guns that appear in a first person shooter, much like the card structure, and not fully marry the card structure,
Hmm.
but give like a tribute to it. And that's still mashing in the genre, and I'm still bringing other elements. Maybe the stats system is from the card system as well, but I'm not fully like standing in two doors and doing
Yeah.
the splits while I do it.
Yeah, and I think like trying to push towards like a 50-50 ratio is another trap that a lot of developers fall into, because at the end of the day, there is one primary core gameplay loop of your title. Whether it
Yeah.
is a first person shooter, a city builder, hack and slash, whatever. And that's going to be your main attractor. And if that's not right, then it's just the experience is just not going to come together. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of indie games, especially over the last 5 to 6 years, that have gone for the we're going to do something completely outside the box nobody's ever done before, And then I play and I go, okay, maybe that's why it was never done before, because it's just not working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And actually, I mean, indie developers learn this the hard way when pitching. A lot of the time when you're bringing like genre mashed games into a pitch and things like that, you either have to have really good comp titles, and let's just say you're unique, right? And you're making a game that no one has mashed together yet. You're the first of your own. Sometimes not having comp titles show you that you're being really innovative. Everyone still has comp titles, but not having like a perfect one-to-one, shows that you're being innovative. Or to counter, and I've heard this before myself, it shows that what you're doing can't be done. Because maybe who's ever tried has never just gained success because it didn't work. So you're always taking that risk when you're doing it. And it does require you to be, one, patient with yourself. I think you should spend time thinking about what you want. And two, to, again, rethink the elements that you really value of those genres. I know we mentioned it being a gateway, but if you really, really value the city building experience, but you just love the like narration of an RPG, I can imagine pulling the narration from an RPG into a city builder. I actually, here's a great example. I gave a tweet a while ago. I'm a big free online thinker, where I post a lot of tweets. But I made a tweet about a game that I really wanted to make, which was a farming simulation game. But I wanted to randomize the town so that one NPC, which will require a lot of narrative work, is actually a serial killer. And you can farm simulate the whole year, but if you don't figure out who this killer is, who's going to be randomized, it could be the spouse that you marry, very standard farming simulator, then you're going to lose a lot of the town by the time it comes to you. And so I'm mixing two genres, right? I'm mixing the thriller games, the mystery games, and I'm putting it into a farming simulator, which has a great base to do that. And it's because I'm not trying to bring in like a fighting mechanic, from those games, or I'm not trying to bring in a new tool system from those games. I kind of picked a base a bit, the farming simulator, and I've injected aspects of other games that I like into it. That's my philosophy. Anyway, I want to make that game. Someone fund me, please.
As you were describing that, it reminds me when I was playing Stardew Valley, and I joked, maybe this is just all like the prequel to the Darkest Dungeon. Like, this is how we build our fortunes, and then we just completely destroy the town.
I love it. Yeah, you mine too deep,
Yeah.
And then the Belrog comes out.
Yeah. A studio that I've been keeping an eye on in terms of like doing stuff very differently is Project Moon. They're a South Korean studio, and they did this game called Library of Ruina. That it is very much unlike any of like the other deck builders or kind of like turn-based RPGs I've seen. And the reason why I brought them up is that I was like looking at their completion rates, or like how the fans were playing through their games. And what I found is that they have a huge amount of churn, like almost within like 30 minutes. Like 30 to 40% of the people who bought the game just said, no, we're not even playing beyond that. But for everyone else who stuck with it, it really like kept their interest. And I think this has always been like that very interesting challenge when you talk about genre mashups, is that when you do something that's either so unique or so different that there is no foundation for somebody to jump off on or jump to, it tends to drive people away because they don't know what to expect. You can describe your game as a first-person shooter, but if it's based on like cooking or I don't know, raising animals or whatever, people are gonna be like, "What the hell is this?" and then run away. But if you can keep them invested or do as much as you can to get them past that hurdle, you can, and we've seen this before with many first-time games, or like the first of their respective niches, that people stick with it because they've never seen it before. FTL is a hard game, but people.
Sorry, that's my dog. She got a chew toy.
That's all right.
Go ahead.
But like with a game like FTL, or even stuff like Factorio, or even going older as when Minecraft blew up, that And I think your dog agrees.
Yeah, I know.
That,
Whenever she hears me on call, she's like, "Now's the time to
of
squeak."
course. And they succeeded because nobody else was really servicing that specific niche at the time.
I really think that it's a fine line, but if you can nail that line, you've really created something amazing.
Hmm.
And I think that you've created, honestly, a new path to a new genre. I would argue that's probably how roguelike started. I don't know. Don't no one fact correct me. But genres, that call themselves roguelike or brawler like or, things of that like probably started from trying to bring in a different aspect of that gameplay into something else.
Yep. I wrote a book on roguelikes as well. That's my third book.
So
That's
you can fact check me.
But yeah, like we talk about kind of not the origins of the original Rogue or like traditional roguelikes, but when we saw that kind of delineation into the action side with Spelunky, Buying Up Isaac, Dead Cells, and so on, it's very much answering that question: what if we take the procedural nature of a roguelike, but let's put into a platformer? Or let's
Yeah,
put into a first person shooter, or Zelda, or whatever.
I love Zelda. But yeah, that's exactly it. And I really think that being kind to yourself and just taking the aspects that you like and not marrying the whole genre, when you do
Hmm.
it, is the way to do it.
Yeah. And but I would also add that for developers listening, you still need to do the research, like you said
Yes.
earlier. Like you need to understand, okay, what do brawlers, fans of brawlers like? They like A, B, C, and D. What do fans of first-person shooters like? They like uh, X, Y, and Z. Because if you don't know what people like and dislike about a genre, it will come back to bite you. And again, that's another thing that I've seen a lot of developers mess up on.
Yeah, exactly that. And not only that, but I think it's really, really important because we use those as marketing terms. We're not really
Mm-hmm.
inventing terms, sadly.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the roguelike as opposed to a new form of rogue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so because we're going to use these terms, there's always going to be a preconceived connotation of what your game is. It's just how we market.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're marketing your game as a roguelike brawler and then you play it and it's mostly a roguelike and none of the and like maybe a few elements of the brawler, the fans who came in because they heard the descriptor brawler are the ones who
Mm-hmm.
are going to notice. And so whenever uh, genre you're using and you're going to use that term, it's how we have to market. Just make sure you do your research on like what aspects of that genre you're here to showcase.
Mm-hmm. Of course, don't forget the ever popular term Metroidvania as well.
Metroidvanias. I love Metroidvanias as well.
Yes. But yeah, again, it's that risk you run, especially when you do genre mashups or you put that in your marketing. Uh, the roguelike. How many, for people listening, you're probably more welcome to this than I am, but like reading forums, is this a roguelike? It's not a roguelike. Yes, it is. No, it's not. What is a roguelike has been a popular meme
What
term or
is
meme
a
question.
roguelike? Yeah, I get it. Honestly, this goes back to my first sentence where I said genres aren't real. In that I think there's tropes and aspects of games that we like, but we're always changing the fundamentals. Every new game is changing the fundamentals in slightly ways. I bet
Mm-hmm.
you we look at Castlevania and then we look at Bloodstains, and they're made by the same director, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we say, is this the same is this the same Metroidvania s game that I played back in the 90s? Is it like the exact same? And the answer is usually no, right? Elements
Mm-hmm.
have changed since you first played it.
Yep, and that's another big point. That it's another trap I see developers fall to when they focus or they go to like retro genres, is that they adopt everything, warts and all.
All the bad
And
ones, all the bad things.
yep, and
There's a lot of. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and there's so much like if you try to make a game like it was in 1993, you're not gonna get new people to play that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't know this is that when those games were made back in the olden days,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the things that we've grown to love in tropes are actually limitations that were there.
Yep.
Uh, I know that you are a big fan of brawlers, but I would argue sometimes the Z plane was an intentional choice for certain limitations and constrictions. Nora, stop it! It's my dog. Certain limitations and constrictions that allowed for them to do a Z plane instead of a full side scroller. And there's a lot of mechanical choices that were made in a lot of retro games. They're not bad in the slightest, but they were using the tools that they had to make those games.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes using those same tools might just be rehashing the same problems when you could be accessing a lot more new and interesting things.
Mm-hmm. I think the most popular example, or one of them, would be having a live system, and game over in a game released today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of my favorite developers, Luca Melito, who makes a lot of modern retro style games. Their titles are specifically retro minded, but still with modern day affordances and approachability elements, so that they may play like Ghosts and Goblins or a shmup or whatever, but they lack the rougher edges of those games from 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, we're actually PG Perfect Garbage is actually on the train of making a game similar in which we are harping on some of the classics that we love, but we're trying to make sure that we've modernized it in a way that's comfortable for folks who want to play it, in
Mm-hmm.
2020,
Yeah.
2021. Um, who knows, 2023 by the time we get it out, right?
Yep. And it is one of those cases where, from a marketing standpoint, it is very high risk, high reward. If you do it wrong, people don't care about your game one way or the other. You do it right, and you are the quote unquote first or the one to do it correctly. That has gone to be, the success for a lot of companies.
You become a standard.
Mm-hmm.
And that's scary in itself, right? Because you have
Yep.
no option. You either become the standard or you fail.
I know it's
Uh,
people who are listening or who watch my video and stuff. We've talked about the risks. Until my face goes it turns blue from running out of oxygen.
it's the truth. And I
Yeah.
think indie game dev is a big risk all the time, especially if in your first or second game when you're trying to get
Mm-hmm.
out there. It's going to be a risk. Just knowing how to handle and mediate. English is hard for me sometimes. Mediate those risks are the most important thing. And I actually think that comes a lot from biz dev and studio direction,
Yep.
producing things of that like. It doesn't actually come from just game design or narrative. It
Yep.
requires a lot of oversight.
Yep. It's good to have somebody who understands the production side, the management side, because that's another point that we certainly don't have the time to get into tonight. But you know that kind of if we just fly by the seat of our pants, the game will get done in 3 to 7 years, and it just works, and most likely it doesn't work.
True. Most
Um,
likely you hyper focused on one aspect without realizing it.
yep. And it is something that I've said many times that one of the reasons why game development is so risky and why you have to do everything right is that consumers can kind of tell very quickly, or sometimes, almost just by seeing one screenshot, is this a game worth pursuing?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's kind of like the old adage, success breeds success. That if you do one thing right, chances are you're doing something else right, and it just repeats. And conversely, if they look at your trailer or they see the first footage of your game, they go, "Oh my god, that looks horrible." They're going to think, "Well, what else is wrong with it?" And unfortunately, I have seen many games that have come out to amazing success, and I've seen games that I've liked that just barely made a whimper on the market.
Oh, that's unfortunately.
Yeah,
It's unfortunately the song and dance we do, right?
yeah.
It's okay. I play to win.
There you go. All right, since I know you have to get running in a few minutes, we've spent the last like 40 minutes or so like talking about game design and our favorite genres, and we even get that far into them. So I
I
think
know.
we
I'm like, now I should have focused on genre bashing with you. I didn't know you were both so invested in that topic.
yeah. But it's good, like we said beforehand, that we're both like more about freeform than coming up with an established script.
Yeah.
But I do want to at least ask you a few questions while we have the time about kind of your experience in writing comics and graphic novels, and how does that approach either differ or is similar to what's going on with Perfect Garbage in terms of writing your games. So,
Sure.
I guess with that, I guess take it away, like in terms of like any thoughts like on like these differences or compare and contrast.
Yeah. So I want to start off with the hottest of takes. A narrative designer can be a writer. Uh, all narrative designers have to write, but not all writers can be a narrative designer,
Hmm.
is like the take. Because narrative design takes a lot of other skill sets than writing
Hmm.
to master. And even I would argue, like, I think we're all learning to still master it. It's a pretty new field. It's come up, what, 6 years ago? Seven
Hmm.
years ago? It hasn't really existed long enough to have, like, uh, ancients in it. But I do want to say that I think it's really, really important when structuring games to understand your narrative and its core pillars. When I came from comics, I came from doing a lot of collaborative work, which I think helps a lot when entering games. You become, in my opinion, or you should become, like Side Eyes, less in love with your own scripts. You should be less precious with your work. And comics, I think, really helps build that up. You go through editing, you go through constant checks, you work with an artist if you're a writer, and even that changes the script and how it's perceived, things like that. And so it teaches you to self edit and also to be comfortable being edited by other people. And that is a huge skill you need in game design because games are not afraid to throw away your script and make you do a new one every few minutes. It's
Hmm.
just the way of the beast. Because there's so many moving parts, you are constantly changing and reformatting and restructuring. Even if you've written a story 4 times, but we decided to change one core mechanic, you're gonna have to write it a fifth time. And it's because, and for me anyway, narrative and narrative design has to be married to mechanics. I
Hmm.
hate the notion that they're separate fields. I really think they should be not one field because I think it's difficult to do both,
Hmm.
but they should be very closely tied to one another. Narrative design and mechanics and game design should be talking to one another all the time. Because if
Hmm.
you can build a narrative as to why the mechanics work in a certain way, then everything feels holistic all of the time. Everything feels like it's meant to be there. If your character punches, but you've narratively built that in some way, small things like maybe he wakes up and there's a punching bag in the background, things like that. These little elements help flesh the gameplay
Hmm.
in the same way. And I actually think that a lot of folks who have never written for games, specifically just folks from the outside, don't realize how much narrative design is not the dialogue that's being talked about. It's how the scene is presented, what you see in that scene, how does the character interact with that scene. That's all narrative. That's all scripted stuff.
Hmm.
And so I guess my main thing is that one, you can't be afraid to be destroyed. You will be remaking everything all the time. That's just games.
Hmm.
And two, you should never be precious with your work either. You're going to have to shape around the mechanics sometimes. I know that people get really emotional about that. They're like, no, narrative is the most important part. I hate when I have to fix myself for mechanics. And I was like that too. I really like narrative. Narrative is my forte.
Hmm.
But I also understand that making a satisfying game feel good sometimes comes first. And then making sure that you can write a story and fit that narrative into that satisfying game loop is how you nail amazing narrative design.
Yep, I'm nodding my head as you were describing that, and it is very much true. And I think that's one of the big hurdles, like people entering the game industry from other mediums fall into, is that if you're making something for a movie or a TV show or a comic, you don't have to worry about how somebody is sitting there in their chair or turning pages. But if you're playing a video game, the moment-to-moment gameplay matters. It matters a lot. And there are a lot of people who they will not care about your story if your character can't jump right, or if it just feels weird to move somebody from one end of a room to the other.
Games gotta feel good. I'm sorry. And people don't want to hear it, but it does. It has to feel good.
Yeah, and I like what you said about marrying narrative or, the story to the mechanics, because Supergiant that you mentioned earlier, they're a really good example of this with Hades.
Yeah.
That, Hades is a action roguelike. It is a game where your main character is supposed to die and you restart the run. And most games would not really tie that to a narrative in any way, shape, or form. But they did that. And, it made the game all the more stronger for it.
Huh. And I would argue, I mean, I know everyone has talked Hades to death, and I love it very much. Shout out Supergiant Games. This is a compliment. But they've really built narrative in all of the design. The UI features a lot of narrative work. The elements, the background designs, the descriptions of every item, even the shades, these little elements, the way Zagreus moves has a lot of narrative relationship, because he takes the boons from the gods that you meet, and those gods have a tone, and that tone is emulated by Zag's move list changes with those boons. So it's like there's so much narrative that's so quiet and loud at the same time because it's in the mechanics. And
I'll give my shout that I just love the writing and the characterizations of everyone in that game, and the fact that everyone's very nonchalant about me busting into their chamber and fighting them for the 20th time.
I feel like that's actually leading to my big final statement on narrative, is that to make a great narrative, and I think Supergiant, I've watched a few videos and they've talked about it as well, is when you sit down to make your game, you write your core pillars. You write exactly what you want this game to feel like early. And when you do that, building on top of it, mechanics and narrative, all those things, you at least have a framework in mind. So them picking the narrative of doing a Hades and running through that, as well as making a roguelike, that's such an intentional choice that build on each other. And I think that's how you make good games. I actually think that's how you make good genre bashing as well. Because you basically take principles that aren't actually fighting each other.
And it's something that I say a lot when it comes to establishing your core gameplay loop, that you need that solid foundation to start with, or anything that you build is going to be, up in the air. And when it comes to game development, you don't want to be still confused about how your game works 2 years into development.
Right.
But I know we are knocking on time, and I don't want you to be late for your appointment that you have after this. So let us wrap things up here for tonight.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
Son, it has been an absolute pleasure hanging out with you on this pre-Labor Day weekend recording. And if you are free in the future, I'm sure we can certainly geek out about any one of the topics we were kind of casually mentioning over the last 40 minutes.
Yeah, I'd love that. And thanks again for having me. It's such a fun experience. It's so cool to talk to someone who also is really fascinated by genre bending. I think it's such a fun topic that, we could probably talk about for hours.
Oh yeah, we could talk about brawlers and horror for hours as well.
Yeah.
All right. Before I let you go, so for people listening to us right now, anything you would like to announce or tease in terms of upcoming projects?
Yeah. So again, quick shout out to Love Shore. It's on Steam. Please wishlist it. It means a lot to us. It's a fun cyberpunk thriller. Lots of bad endings. That's how we roll. But please keep a watch on Perfect Garbage. You can find us on Twitter as Perfect Garbo. And we are making a really new, exciting game that we have to be really hush-hush about. But once you see it, it will be worth it. In my opinion. Yeah.
And there should be links to everything that Sun just mentioned in the description down below for those of you watching or listening to this.
Yeah.
So,
well,
Oh, go right ahead.
I was gonna say thank you so much for having me. It was so fun.
No problem. It was great chatting. I'm glad we were finally get our times and such working to get this going.
Yeah.
Right. So, for those of you watching or listening to us right now, we're going to end things here. As always, if you're new, do the liking, subscribing, all that great stuff. You'll find links to my Twitter and Discord and all that in the description as well. If you are a developer working on an upcoming game and would like to come on and chat about or just chat about design in general, feel free to reach out. And come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.
Ciao.